The dominant and the other. The concept of the dominant and the other is something that we use when we try to understand the relationships of inequality that we have with each other. And it starts with the concept of diversity. Diversity means a wealth of variety. That's all that diversity means. However, somehow, diversity has been linked to patterns of inequality. So we start with the idea that we have people, and people represent a wealth of stories. And out of these wealth of stories, there's a story that has risen and that has become dominant. And when we have a dominant story, what happens to the other stories? The other stories become overlooked, silenced, marginalized, cast aside, treated as less than, etc., etc. And thus, we have come to a pattern where a story has become dominant and where being other means automatically less than. This is something that we have created as humans. And so we have learned things about being in the dominant position, namely that your story always matters. You get to speak first, the loudest, your story is validated, and we have learned something about being in the position of the other. Your story is less than, overlooked, silenced, etc. We have created this as human beings, and together we keep this in place. Now, why do we use the concept of dominant and the other? Two main reasons. First is to show that all of us are in the position of dominance sometime, and all of us are in the position of the other sometimes, depending on the situation, depending on the context. And so, yes, dominant can be about whiteness versus people of color. Dominant can be about men versus women. Dominant can be about women versus men. Dominant can be about adults versus children. It can be about those who work on the fourth floor and those who work in the basement. It can be about LGB versus the T. It can be about being from the city versus being from the rural area. It can be about anything and everything. All of us are in the position of dominance sometimes, and all of us are in the position of the other sometime. Again, depending on the situation and the context. Another reason why we use the concept of dominant and the other is to clearly show that we are not separate from each other, but we stand in relationship to each other. Sometimes you might hear the language used of the oppressor versus the oppressed. This is not language that we use, even though it's a concept, a theoretical concept that is helpful. But the concept of the oppressor versus the oppressed gives the illusion that we are separate from each other, and we are not. In this model of dominant and the other, we start with the principle that this is about all of us. And so some of us are placed in a position of dominance, some of us are in the position of the other, but ultimately it is always about us. There is no them, there is no those. And so our goal then is, how will we treat all the stories that we have, this rich variety of stories? How do we treat those stories as valid? That is the goal. And in order to do so, we have to understand how the concept of dominant and the other works. We have to understand that we as human beings have created this model of inequality. And it is not just about the content of stories, but it is also about how we do stories. So for instance, when we pursue knowledge, you might have heard of evidence-based knowledge. Evidence-based knowledge is very valid, but it has become a dominant way of pursuing knowledge. And so other ways of pursuing knowledge are being considered as less than, overlooked, marginalized, etc. Rather than saying that evidence-based knowledge is a form or one of the many forms that we can pursue knowledge, we've elevated it to become part of the dominant story. And so our goal then is to start validating the wealth of stories that we have, regardless of the topic. And we do that by understanding that these patterns of inequality did not happen overnight. These patterns of the dominant and the other and how we relate to each other did not happen overnight. It took hundreds of years to get to this point. And there are all kinds of mechanisms that have contributed to it. And there are all kinds of mechanisms that maintain it. And so even when we try to strive for more equality, even when we try to start validating these different stories, there are all kinds of mechanisms that will jump into place and that will prevent us from doing so. So our goal then is to start picking up on what the mechanisms are so that we can disrupt them. One major mechanism is that of language. How we use language helps us maintain the dominant versus the other. For instance, white privilege. White privilege is a very valid theoretical concept, but sometimes the mention of white privilege is used to shut people up. Similarly, if somebody's in the position of other and tries to speak up, they might be told that they are a victim. And again, it is used to shut people up. How do we use language to maintain the divide between the dominant and the other? Another mechanism that we have is our reward system. Which behaviors do we reward and which behaviors do we punish? In our educational system, when people speak out, they are rewarded for that. And those who are quiet are seen as dumb, less than, etc., etc. In our goal then to overcome the division between the dominant and the other, we have to start learning what our mechanisms are, and then we have to be brave enough to address them. There are four core concepts. The first overarching concept is that we are in this together, that we are connected to anything and everything. That's our starting point. And so this work is always about us. That's our overarching concept. Then we will look at care, courage, and humility. When we try to address the dominant versus the other, we need to come from a place of caring. We do this work because we care. Show up and show that you care. It is not about how much you know, but it's about how much you care. You can make mistakes. It's okay to not know, but show that you care. Part of caring also means that you have to learn how to care for yourself. Addressing the dominant and the other can be emotionally draining. So you need to learn how to listen to your body and take the cues to know when you've had enough, when you need to take a break, when you need to leave and come back so you can go at it again. It is very important that we strive and include this concept of health as we do this work of restoring how we relate to each other. Second is courage. When we're going to start to address these mechanisms, when we are going to speak up and try to disrupt these patterns that we have, it requires you to be brave and courageous. Sometimes you might be the only one to speak up and speak out. Will you still do it? So it is important to be courageous. However, it is important that courage is always paired with wisdom. It is easy to kick in the door, but the door can slam back in your face just as easily. So when you are one to speak up, you need to make sure that you do it at the right time, at the right place, in the right tone, to the right person, etc., etc. So do take action, but you have to be strategic. The goal is always to connect and validate the story. The goal is not just to disrupt. And third requires humility. Humility in understanding that when we do this work, know that you will say stupid things, you will make mistakes, you will do dumb things. Know that the people you encounter will say stupid things, they will do dumb things, they will make mistakes. And so it is important that we learn how to forgive ourselves, and how to forgive each other. Care, courage, and humility. And this is how we will address these patterns of inequality that have come to being through the dominant versus the other.